So good evening. For a change, we'll start on time. We've created a record of being late every single time we've done this. So welcome to the third edition of our energy symposium here, critical issues in energy. Today we're going to be talking about nuclear energy, talk about the various facets of it, risks, odds, potential, and I believe you're going to meet an incredibly well-versed panel here that is going to talk about this issue. So I'd like to welcome all of you. I'm Ramanan Krishnamurthy. I'm the Chief Energy Officer here at the University of Houston, and it is my pleasure to have you all be here. We would like to thank our media partner, Houston Public Media. They've helped us put the word out about the symposium, and we certainly have a great partnership with Houston Public Media. I'd like to recognize our President's Energy Advisory Board. The board is made up of industry experts and leaders who've given UH strategic advice to advance the university's efforts in education and research in the energy area. And this is truly their brainchild, along with a former dean of the natural sciences and mathematics, Mark Smith. And I'm just simply executing that idea that started from them and trying to give it further life. I'd like to thank our student ambassadors and Energy Coalition volunteers for helping out tonight. These are, for those of you who don't know what the Energy Coalition is, it is a transformational student group at the University of Houston. We have about 5,000 students as part of the Energy Coalition. That's about an eighth of all of the students that go to U of H. So it's truly a remarkable culmination of bringing students together to address energy challenges, both in terms of education and real-world problem solving. A quick note about Q&As. We will not be having a free mic moving around. We encourage all of you to submit your questions through our web portal. You should be able to access this on your mobile phones. It is a really easy place for you to go in there and put in your questions. We will collate those questions and make them available to the moderator here, who will pick and choose and sort of try and get a good balance of questions to address with our panelists here. So I've talked a while trying to make sure that we give all the late stragglers a chance to get in, but I don't want to delay us any further. And I'd like to introduce our moderator here, Ryan Fitzpatrick, who's the Deputy Director of Clean Energy Program at Third Way. Ryan comes from a viewpoint about how to decarbonize the world, looking at alternate fuels, looking at nuclear, and he's really a thought leader in the space of the challenges and the opportunities associated with nuclear power. So without further ado, Ryan Fitzpatrick. Thanks.
I turned on here. Thank you. Thanks to the university also for hosting us. So as Ramanan said, my name is Ryan Fitzpatrick, and I'm with Third Way. We're a think tank in Washington, D.C., and we focus on creative solutions to some of the most complex problems that we face as a country. And we started engaging in nuclear through our climate change work, and I dare you to find a more complex problem than climate change. If there are rivals, we found that nuclear also traverses through them. Things like national security and economic competitiveness, global poverty, just to name a few. So nuclear crosses through a lot of very important and urgent issues. So I'm really glad that this panel will have the opportunity to talk more broadly about the implications of this technology. And clearly we're here to talk about nuclear energy, but we could just as easily have this type of conversation, and hopefully maybe someday we'll have this conversation about wind, natural gas, solar, coal, hydropower. And that's because there is no silver bullet. There's no one technology that perfectly meets every last need of a modern energy grid. Affordable, reliable, clean, low emissions, safe, publicly supported. There are pros and cons. There are strengths and weaknesses. And nuclear definitely has its fair share of both. So I won't take up too much more time, but I will say that I think it's important to have these types of conversations, give people more information, and then allow them to make decisions, because they do really devolve into decisions. We choose based on the pros and cons, the strengths and weaknesses, what we want to see in our energy system. So looking forward to a conversation here with our panelists, and then the Q&A, as Ramanan mentioned, so please submit your questions. And we can go ahead and get started. We're going to hear from Armand. Armand Cohen is going to tell us about he'll be making the case for nuclear in the context of deep decarbonization.
Great. Thanks, Ryan, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak tonight. So I want to address two questions. I'll probably get to the first more than the second, why nuclear, and second, what nuclear. So let's start with the climate issue. The 195 nations met in Paris in 2015, and now we have an agreement in legal force which says we want to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius and pursue efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Well, what does that mean? It means a zero carbon energy system, and zero means zero. That's what the modeling says. For everything, electricity, we're going to talk mostly about electricity tonight, but also transport and industry, within 40 to 50 years as global energy demand doubles from increased wealth and development. What are our options to grow the energy system services by twofold, let's say, over 60 years and go to zero carbon? Well, there are basically four. There's reduce demand by efficiency. There's adopt zero carbon renewable energy like wind and solar. There's scrub the carbon out of fossil energy or from the atmosphere, sometimes called carbon capture and storage. And there's nuclear energy. Sorry, and I'll go backwards here, sorry. So the case I want to make to you tonight is that each of these options has challenges at scale. That's what makes it such a hard problem. As Ryan said, if we could do this all with one thing, then we'd be done. Let's start with efficiency. The first reality is we're probably not going to conserve our way out of this problem. Underlying demand for light, heat, and motion will grow as the world gets richer. We can mitigate that curve a little bit, but we can't eliminate growth. An example is 50 million new air conditioning units per year are sold in China. It's the most popular wedding gift in India. 5 million a year are sold in the US. The developing world is going to need lots of energy. You can make those units twice as efficient as American units, but there's still going to be growth. Nuclear challenges. Let's start with the fact that typically costs more than equivalent gas and coal. Slow to build. The best units are getting built still in 4 or 5 years' time. And there are public acceptance issues that Shirley's going to talk about in terms of accident risk, waste, and proliferation. Carbon capture and storage has challenges. First of all, it adds fossil fuel costs directly and via load to operate the scrubbing equipment. And you must construct and operate substantial underground pipeline and storage infrastructure. So everything has its issues. I want to focus on renewables in particular, partly because another panelist is going to go into this in deep and say that, at least it's my view, and my research leads me to the conclusion that renewables also have very, very significant challenges that do not make it a silver bullet. First, there's the fact that the direct cost of production is typically, in most cases, higher than fossil energy. Because the wind doesn't always blow, sun doesn't always shine, there is seasonal intermittency that can't be addressed by daily storage. We think of batteries as mitigating this problem, but in fact, these cycles tend to be seasonal. Finally, there's substantial infrastructure build-out required generation and transmission. The seasonal problem can be illustrated by these three charts. The two of them are for California, and what you see is, let's see if I've got the laser pointer here. This is the year on the x-axis, and you see that the capacity factor, the amount of energy that wind energy puts out, kind of rises pretty steeply towards the middle of the year, likewise for PV, but very, very low shoulders. Germany shows the same pattern for photovoltaics. This is June. The big orange bars and the little blue lines are January. So you can see like a 2- or 3-fold difference. So this is not a daily problem that's going to be managed by charging up a battery one day or half a day and discharging it the next. Wind is also highly correlated across continental scale. The wind is not always blowing somewhere, as it is often said. I mean, It is to some extent, but it also tends to be highly correlated. So low wind days in the east tend to be low wind days in the west. Battery storage is not going to solve this problem. This is a picture of Germany in 2050 at its 80% wind and solar goal. And you can see the blue line is daily load, yellow is deficit, what's not supplied by renewables, by wind and solar. You see overproduction on some days in orange, but in that particular month, this is October in 2050, there's still a very large need, the red line, for residual capacity to provide that energy, and that's with storage. So essentially you need dispatchable, that is on-demand power nearly equal to peak demand in most of these seasons, in most of these studies, and seasonal storage, or you need seasonal storage capacity roughly in the same range as your peak demand. That's expensive and not easy to do. In addition, the scale of a renewable energy build-out, if we're going to do this all with wind and solar, for example, and you're going to hear an argument that we should, is very, very challenging in terms of just pure scale. To take one study, which actually is Mark's study, looking at the US and trying to supply all energy from wind and solar, every state would have to build 22 of the nation's largest wind farms. Every coastal state would have to build 41 of the world's largest offshore wind farms to supply the energy. 1,200 times more central solar PV plants than exist today. Seasonal storage that's twice the size of the US electric system, using technologies that have really not been demonstrated commercially at anything like this scale. And the ability to just basically turn off industry for 8-hour stretches when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining. I mean, that's the kind of assumptions you see in these studies, and I think they're great thought experiments because they tell you how challenging it would be to do all of this with renewables. If we do less of it, and if we have a mix of things, a lot easier. Also doubling the size of transmission. Is this doable theoretically? Maybe. Is it highly risky as a sole strategy in the real world to get to zero carbon? I would argue most definitely that we should not put all our eggs in that basket. That's been the conclusion of numerous studies from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the United Nations Deep Decarbonization Study, the recent Obama administration's mid-century 80% carbon reduction study anticipates between a 2 and a 3 times or fold increase in nuclear. The wisdom, I think, of going forward to a deeply decarbonized world is that we need it all. We need energy efficiency, we need renewable energy, we're going to need some kind of decarbonized fossil energy for the grid, transport, and heavy industry, and next generation nuclear. But we need better nuclear, and Jessica's going to address this in detail. I don't know, do I have a couple minutes to? Okay, let me just tee this up, and Jessica's going to go in more depth. As I mentioned, nuclear has some challenges, no question. Cost, there is concern about safety, there are issues around waste, all non-trivial, and I completely put that out front. I'm encouraged because I see a generation of nuclear technology coming forward that essentially eliminates water from the equation using coolants with much higher phase change points, melt points, if you will. And what does that do? Why is that different? You know, basically, we've been using light water reactors for the last 50 years. Why does this make a difference? Well, first of all, there's the radically reduced accident risk and off-site impacts. If Fukushima, Chernobyl, and Three Mile Island all had a common denominator, which was the boiling off of cooling water. If you use something like molten salts or lead or sodium that have much higher, 600-700 degree phase change points, you're going to have less risk of accident and loss of coolant. Also, because you don't have a lot of water under pressure, you're operating more or less at atmospheric pressure. That eliminates the need for pressurized containment vessels. When you look at a nuclear plant, most of that is the containment vessel. The actual nuclear unit is very small. If you can take all that concrete steel out, which is about 2/3 reduction for these advanced reactors in concrete and steel, you reduce the cost and you shorten and make more predictable the construction times. There are 50 startups in the US, Canada, UK, and the EU that are all working on versions of this technology. We've taken a look at 12 of those companies and tried to cost where they will be. The current latest generation of light water technology, the so-called AP1000s being built in Georgia and South Carolina right now, are expected to come in at about $6,500 a kilowatt overnight costs. South Korea seems to be delivering units around the world closer to 3,500, although it's not clear exactly how reliable that estimate is. What the game changer here is the advanced units that we've looked at that come in on the high end at about $2,000 per kilowatt overnight, and on the low end about $1,500. So a big step change in cost. So my conclusion I want to leave you with is that more options are better and increase our chance of success. Nuclear should be among those options. You can look at more information that kind of backs up some of the things in my presentation at this website, and I don't know whether we're going to be sending the slides around. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Armin. So we had Armin Cohen from Clean Air Task Force telling us why nuclear is important for meeting our climate goals. And next we're going to have Dr. Mark Jacobson, who is the director of the Atmosphere and Energy Program at Stanford University, tell us about some assessments that he has done showing how we could possibly meet those goals without nuclear. Thank you, Dr. Jacobson.
Sorry, just paging through.
This is not an endorsement of Armin's ideas.
Yeah, these are the previous slides.
All right.
Okay, that's me. So I'm going to talk about how to repower the United States and the world, in fact, with entirely clean and renewable energy without nuclear, without coal, with carbon capture, without natural gas, without biofuels, at low cost, and keep the grid stable. So how do we do it? It's all with wind and water and solar power. So we have to transform all energy sectors. It's electricity, transportation, heating, cooling, industry, agriculture, forestry, and fishing. And the idea here is to electrify everything, then provide that electricity with clean, renewable energy only. So for for transportation, we'd use electric vehicles, and some for long-distance transport, like even long-distance aircraft, long-distance ships, long-distance trucks, hybrid hydrogen fuel cell with electric drivetrains. And for heating, cooling, we'd use heat pumps, which extract heat out of the air or out of the ground or out of water for heating, and also can be run in reverse for air conditioning. They run on electricity. They're very efficient. For stoves, we'd use induction cooktop stoves, for example. They run on electricity. They're just as fast as gas. And for industry, we'd use lots of high-temperature industrial processes, electric arc furnaces, induction furnaces, dielectric heating. And then all the electricity would be provided by wind, onshore and offshore wind, concentrated solar power, photovoltaics on rooftops and in power plants, existing hydroelectric power, and small amounts of tidal and wave power, and minor amounts of geothermal as well. For storage, we would use for electricity concentrated solar power is associated with storage, pumped hydroelectric power. Existing hydroelectric power is basically a big battery that you can discharge as you want. And batteries actually would be the last option. In fact, I'm going to show you solutions you don't even need batteries, but for stationary storage, that's also an option, but a more expensive one at this time. For heating, cooling, we would simply use water, ice, and rocks and soil. And I'll show you examples of that in a second. And for other, hydrogen is a form of storage, and we'd also use what's called demand response, which is when utilities give people incentives not to use power at certain times of the day. And of course, energy efficiency is built into this as well. But just to give you an example of some existing low-cost storage, ice. My university, Stanford's had a big ice cube under a building since 1998. And instead of using air conditioning in the afternoon, which is the peak time of the afternoon when most people use the air conditioning, they actually freeze ice at night using low-cost electricity, and then during the day they run water through coils in the ice to cool it and use that to cool the buildings. And similarly, the university also just last year bulldozed a natural gas cogen plant that provided 80% of the heat and electricity for the campus and replaced it with 2 boilers and a chiller and solar PV, because a lot of energy is wasted just by creating cold and hot. And if you actually capture that energy, store it in the boilers and the chillers, and recirculate it around campus where it's needed, you can eliminate lots of energy use. So those are 2 types of cheap storage. And to give you an idea, this ice storage is about $30 to $40 a kilowatt hour compared to batteries, which are about $300 a kilowatt hour. Another kind, seasonal heat storage, Arnon mentioned about it's hard to keep seasonal energy because there's big fluctuations in demand seasonally. Well, this is a town in Okotoks, Canada, south of Calgary, about 1 hour. About 12 years ago, 52 homes were built where they have a hot water collectors on the roofs of garages that have a glycol solution. Sunlight hits that solution, heats up. The solution then gets passed through water to water in this building on the right. And the water then gets piped underground under this field, which is a play field. It's a park surrounded by homes. And they have rocks. They excavated that field, put in rocks. The hot water heats the rocks up to 80 degrees Celsius. It's stored until winter time, where it provides 100% now of the heat for these 52 homes when there's snow on the ground. So this is an example of seasonal heat storage. This costs $1 a kilowatt hour compared to $300 a kilowatt hour for batteries. Now, can we actually match all power demand worldwide with clean renewable energy? So here are the numbers. The end-use power demand for all purposes in 2012 was about 12.1 trillion watts, or terawatts. If we go to 2050, that goes up to around 21 terawatts. But if we electrify everything, and we provide the electricity with clean renewable energy, and some additional end-use energy efficiency improvements, we get a reduction of power demand by about 42.5%. Because 23% of all energy worldwide is wasted due to the inefficiency of combustion versus electricity. Another 13% is wasted due to the energy used in mining, transporting, and refining fossil fuels and uranium. And then there's an additional 7% end-use energy efficiency improvements you can get from just beyond the business as usual expectations. So we go down to 11.8 terawatts of energy, which is needed if you actually electrify everything and provide that electricity with clean renewable energy. So we're going to try and match that 11.8 terawatts. So this is one way to do it. Worldwide, it's with 1.6 million onshore wind turbines, 935,000 or so offshore wind turbines, and you can see the rest of the numbers. But onshore wind is 23.5%, offshore is 13.6%, residential rooftop PV is about 16%, commercial government rooftop PV is about 12%, solar PV power plants around 20%, CSP power plants is about 10%, geothermal is about less than 1%, hydro, which all exists today, is around 4%, and then tiny amounts of tidal and wave. That's providing all energy to power the entire world for all purposes, eliminating all global warming, eliminating 4 to 7 million air pollution deaths per year, providing energy stability. And you might ask, well, how much land does that take? This is the requirements, the land requirements. For the onshore wind, it's 0.92% of the world's land area for spacing between wind turbines, which can be used for agriculture or open space or rangeland or farmland. The PV, utility scale PV and CSP takes up about 0.22% of the world's land. And rooftop PV doesn't take up any additional land. Geothermal hardly takes up any additional land. There's some offshore wind. But we're talking about around 1% of the world's land to repower the entire world for all purposes. That does not talk about eliminating, that doesn't even account for eliminating all the fossil fuel and nuclear infrastructures. Now, what about keeping the grid stable? So we did plans for 139 countries of the world and for the 50 United States. And then we've broken up the 139 countries into 20 world regions. And then we've modeled the wind and solar output based on the number of wind turbines and solar panels, et cetera, in each of these countries over, so far, a 4-year period. Every 30 seconds for 4 years, we have intermittent wind and solar output and all the other output from the other technologies. And then we compared those, the demand or the supply, with the load for energy. We got load data for over 100 countries, and we were able to then estimate what the loads were in nearby countries as well based on that. And then we ran this through a grid integration model and added storage, all the low-cost storage that I talked about, and no batteries in these simulations, just CSP with storage, pumped hydro storage, hydroelectric power, and water, ice, and rocks for heating, hydrogen, and also some demand response. And so I'm going to just run really quickly through the results for all 20 world regions. But the summary is that we were able to keep the grid stable in every single region of the world, 20 world regions. Here, that was the US, and that was North America. Here's Central America. Here's Cuba. Okay, all these graphs show the red is energy supply, the blue is demand plus change in storage plus losses plus shedding. So it accounts for everything. They match exactly for all 4 years, all 20 regions. Here's the Haiti, Dominican Republic, Jamaica, South America, New Zealand, Australia, Southeast Asia, Philippines, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, China, Hong Kong, Mongolia, North Korea, Russia, Georgia, India, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Central Asia, Middle East, Europe, Iceland, Africa. Those are all, the whole world, we kept stable. So it's no longer true that renewables cause the grid to be unstable. This is actually a solvable problem, and that's a way to solve it. Here's the cost of energy that results. For all the average cost among all the countries I just showed you, all the world regions, is 9.8 cents a kilowatt hour for the electric portion of the cost, if you want to compare to business as usual electric. All energy is 10.7 cents a kilowatt hour. But to compare with the fossil fuels, which are also 9.8 cents a kilowatt hour for the direct cost of energy, fossil fuels also have another 12.7 cents a kilowatt hour in health costs and 15.8 cents a kilowatt hour in climate costs, so cost a total of 38 cents a kilowatt hour versus 9.8 for wind, water, solar. Why not nuclear? It's 6 to 24 times more CO2 per kilowatt hour than wind. It takes 10 to 19 years between planning and operation, while the construction time can be from 4 to 9 years. The actual siting and getting a permit for the site and then the construction permit and issue is actually another 6 to 10 years. So you have to add those together and you get 10 to 19 years. It costs 2.5 to 4 times that of new onshore wind and utility PV. It takes 2 to 10 times longer then to get 25 to 40% of the CO2 savings per dollar than wind or solar. So it's not as good of a solution. The Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change also says there's robust evidence and high agreement that increased use of nuclear leads to more weapons proliferation risk, meltdown risk, melting risk, and we can, so let's look at, can you use nuclear to solve the global warming? No, you cannot. You need to have 1.5 degrees warming. 1.5 degree warming is what we're trying to get to. It's impossible to solve global warming. It's impossible to solve global warming with nuclear because it takes so long just to get it to operate. You need you can allow 350 to 575 gigatons of CO2 emissions after 2015 to stay below 1.5 degree warming. Converting 80% wind water to wind water solar by 2030 and 100% by 2050 emits 415 grams of CO2, gigatons of CO2, limiting warming. But nuclear, it's impossible because it takes so long just to plan, permit, and operate a plant. It's absolutely impossible to actually solve the global warming problem with it. So I'm just going to leave you with these slides. We found that we can keep the grid stable with 100% wind, water, and solar. Nuclear can't solve the problem. The cost of energy from wind, water, and solar is low. I'm not saying it's the lowest cost, but it's a low cost that you can solve these problems with. And if you're interested in slides or graphics, here are some websites that you can get more information at. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mark. And just a reminder to the audience, appreciate you being respectful and using the system that we have in place to submit questions. We can keep going now. So Jessica Lovering is going to talk to us next a little bit about the upfront cost of nuclear, which we were just discussing, and how we might be able to radically reduce that. And Jessica is with the Breakthrough Institute and is the director of the energy program at that organization.
All right, thank you, Ryan, and thank you for the host for inviting me to speak. I'm very passionate about this topic, and I hope to answer lots of questions later on. I am going to focus on cost, but I have a lot of background knowledge on sort of all issues around nuclear. That's my main focus of study, so welcome any question. But Armin went through a lot of the reasons why we need nuclear, particularly for its reliability and its stable costs. I just wanted to add really quick that nuclear is the US's largest source of clean energy. It's also Europe's largest source of clean energy. And it's also, from history, the fastest clean energy source to scale up in terms of how much clean energy you could add per year. So those are really important from an environmental perspective if you're looking at how do we build a lot of clean energy really fast. So When I talk to people, mostly I talk to environmentalists who are concerned about climate change, and when I talk to them about the problem of climate change and pollution, I'm really surprised that the question about nuclear that they usually have is about the cost. Especially the high upfront cost seems to be insurmountable and take too much effort if we're really trying to solve climate change very rapidly. So that's what I'm going to dig into today and really focus on, is how much of a burden is that cost, and is there a way to bring that cost down a lot? So let's think about the historic cost of nuclear power. So when you think about this, whether you realize it or not, you've probably got this chart in your head. Well, you at least have this story in your head about nuclear costs. So what I'm showing on the y-axis is the construction cost of a nuclear power plant, that upfront cost. And the x-axis is time. So this is the whole history of nuclear construction in the US and France. US is blue. So the US is the story most people think of. It started off very cheap, cheaper than coal in a lot of places, and utilities really wanted to build it, and then it rapidly grew in costs. Tripled, quadrupled in cost through the 70s and 80s. And that's really for one of the reasons we stopped building plants, and we haven't been building plants for the last 30 years. We did bring the first plant online last year in 30 years. Now contrast that with the experience of France is very different. France started a little bit after the US with their big commercial program, but they started a little bit more expensive than the US, but maintained very low and just gradually increasing costs. And they did that through reactor standardization, building a lot of reactors at the same site, and having a very centralized control over regulation and industrial policy. So these are very different experiences. But that's only a very small part of the story, because there are 31 other countries that have commercial nuclear power. And for a long time, we didn't really know what the cost history was in those countries. But we did a big study to try and dig those up. So we found costs for 7 countries total for the whole history of their nuclear program. That's what I'm going to show here. So this is a bigger picture. And I'm not going to go into all these details, but you can see that there's a lot of different stories in here and a lot of different trends in nuclear costs. But just to highlight some of the main ones, we can see that in the early history of commercial nuclear power, costs fell a lot. And this was through innovation, through R&D, and also through economies of scale, building bigger reactors. And then there's a low point. This is when the big commercial programs take off, and you can see that countries go in a lot of different directions. We have Japan. It's kind of in the middle between the US and France. There's India, there's West Germany. I won't go into those. But the big story here, the one that's the most interesting, is South Korea, and that's the purple color. So South Korea started by importing French, Canadian, and US designs, and then they established their own domestic reactor, which was standardized, and they built a lot of them. They built a lot of them at the same site. And they had falling costs over time. They also had shrinking construction durations. So South Korea is building nuclear plants in about 4 years. So to zoom in on those costs, what's happening now, as I said, the US didn't build plants for 30 years, but we do have 4 under construction right now, and they're coming in right here. Now that's expensive, but it's not as bad as it was in the 70s or 80s. And these are first of a kind, passively safe, what we call Gen 3 plus plants. And these are the first ones that have been built in the world. So we expect them to come down in cost, but they're already pretty good. And they're going to generate electricity pretty cheaply. But in South Korea, what I'm showing here, these plants actually aren't being built in South Korea. Does anyone know where these plants are being built? UAE, yes. So Korea really wants to become the world leader in exporting nuclear reactor technology. So they're building their first plants outside of their border in the United Arab Emirates. So building 4 these advanced Gen 3 plus plants. And they're coming in right around here, about $23.90, $100 per kilowatt. And that's very cheap. Now, it's particularly cheap because the UAE doesn't have any nuclear power right now. They're a new nuclear country. And so to set up the entire industry from scratch to build in a different country, this is pretty incredible. And this is what we'd like to see more of, particularly for countries that are rapidly increasing their consumption of electricity. They need these big, large-scale plants, and it would be amazing if they were all low-carbon generation technologies. So if Korea is successful here, we'd like to see this model in other countries, especially ones that are rapidly industrializing and have that large growth in electricity. But coming back to these really expensive reactors in the US, they're actually not that bad because most of these are still operating today. And they're actually generating really cheap electricity. So this is a chart of real generating costs across the US for actual plants, how much it costs them to generate electricity. And nuclear comes in here at about $25 a megawatt hour, or 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour. You might recognize that number from your utility bill. But we'll just say it's 2.5. Fossil steam, coal or natural gas is more closer to 3.7. Hydro is very cheap because most hydro plants were built 100 years ago. And they're very cheap. And then gas turbines are pretty high too. So even though those plants were way over budget, very expensive to build, they're generating cheap electricity today, and that's because they generate 24/7, huge amounts of power for 40, going on 60, maybe 80 years. So these are really good investments for the long term. But why is that not so great? So, because of that high upfront cost, utilities don't want to build them as much anymore. So let's look at sort of the future costs really quick. I'm going to speed through these. This is from EIA looking at how much will it cost to generate electricity from a new power plant that starts up in 2022. Nuclear's here. They call it advanced nuclear. It's not that advanced. It's those AP1000s that we're building right now in the US. So it's about here. Here are the intermittent renewables, onshore solar, offshore wind, solar thermal. And they have a big spread because they're very geographic and resource dependent. Then you have hydro, biomass, and geothermal. And, nuclear is in there with them, so that's good. But the big thing that we're trying to compete with, especially going forward, is going to be combined cycle gas turbines and natural gas. So that's the cost that they're projecting of natural gas in 2022. So that's sort of what we compete with. And some of these, nuclear comes pretty close. But ultimately, we'd like it to be cheaper. And we do think that the advanced reactors are going to come in here at about 40 or 50, so below the cost of natural gas going forward. Okay, but the big thing, and Arma mentioned this a lot, is that we need baseload power and dispatchable power, and our options are pretty limited to geothermal, hydro, biomass, and nuclear, and all of these have different kinds of problems, which we can talk more about, but nuclear is one of the only ways that you can get baseload low-carbon power, except hydro. So, limited options. So just in conclusion, we need a mix. Particularly from what we've seen in recent history, when nuclear plants shut down, they're replaced by fossil fuels. They're not replaced by renewables, and that's a lose for the climate. So particularly, this is a chart for Germany, and we think of Germany as being a leader in renewable energy. Germany has actually built more coal plants, new coal plants in the last 10 years than the rest of the EU combined. And that's because they're shutting down their nuclear, but they still need baseload, especially to offset all of their intermittent renewable energy. They also import and export a lot with their neighbors to balance their grid. So it's not so clean, and we've seen a similar thing in California. When San Onofre closed in California, the state's power sector emissions jumped 50% in 1 year. That's not the direction we want to be going in if we're concerned about climate change. Similar story in New England with the recent closures, and in Japan at a very large scale. So studies that look at different types of mixes find that ones that have a lot of nuclear are cheaper, they're more feasible, and this is going to be a hard task to mitigate climate change and stop sort of catastrophic risks. So we want to keep all our options on the table, and we want to do what's cheapest, easiest, least painful for the people and the economy. So Okay, cost is still a big burden. Okay, so I'll just say that, as Armin mentioned, we want to go smaller and we want to go factory produced. That's the big thing. So there's a company in the US called NuScale. They just submitted their license last year, and they're building really tiny reactors, 45 megawatts. That's unheard of small in the nuclear industry, but they're going to build them like cars or airplanes on a factory assembly line and then ship them to the site. And they're planning to build their first plant in Idaho to supply electricity for Salt Lake City and to replace some of the coal plants that they want to phase out there. So that's a great model. That's what we want to see more of in the US. All right, and as Armin mentioned, there's these Gen 4 designs, molten salt, thorium, metal-cooled, breeders, burners, floaters, all sorts of different designs that we can talk more about. They're much safer, they're meltdown-proof. Most of them are doing modular fabrication. They have much higher thermal efficiency, and most of them are going to be radically cheaper, and I do want to make this point. It seems counterintuitive that if something was much, much safer, it'd also be much, much cheaper, but that's how the physics of nuclear reactors work out. It turns out, if you move away from light water reactors, it becomes much easier to have passive intrinsic safety, and it also cuts down a lot of your costs because you have less steel, because you're not pressurizing, you have less concrete because you have a smaller footprint, you're burning more of the fuel, so you don't have to do so many refueling outages. A lot of these they produce much less waste. A lot of them can use recycled fuel or actually burn waste as fuel. They're much more proliferation resistant. A lot of different business models. I mentioned doing floating reactors, doing build, own, operate, remove model, which is selling a nuclear reactor like a battery, okay, where you send it to a site, maybe in sub-Saharan Africa, they operate it for 10 or 20 years, and then when it's done, you bring it back to a central reprocessing facility, maybe in the US, so that cuts out that proliferation risk. And lastly, there's a growing industry. There's 50 startups in the US working on all sorts of different advanced reactor designs. Faces you recognize like Bill Gates, but then a lot of young engineers who are really motivated by climate change to solve this problem, and they think that nuclear is the best solution, and I hope I've convinced you that it is. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. And last up, we are lucky to have Dr. Shirley Ho flew in yesterday from Singapore, where she is assistant chair of the Wee Kim Wee School of Communications and Information at Nanyang Technological University. Thank you so much, Shirley. We're looking forward to hearing a little bit more about the research that you have done on public perception of nuclear energy.
Right. Thank you, Ryan. This is me, Shirley Ho. I flew in all the way from Singapore yesterday, and hopefully, I could keep myself awake throughout my presentation. It's really interesting to see and hear about the different perspectives from the earlier speakers. Some of them talk about the risk of nuclear energy, but also talk about how other renewable energies might be a possibility above and beyond nuclear. Now, I'd like to add to what they have talked about today by providing a different facet of nuclear energy, which is to talk about public perception of nuclear energy and how different factors may shape public attitudes toward this controversial science. Well, as you have seen from earlier presentations, nuclear energy is actually a very controversial science that polarizes public opinion. Proponents of nuclear energy have stated that, stated the key benefits of it, which is low carbon emissions, which in this case could be helpful to eliminate, to mitigate the effect of climate change. The other key arguments that proponents put forward is secure energy supply, in that nuclear energy could provide a reliable source of energy for the people. On the other hand, critics have also argued the risk of nuclear energy, including the proliferation of nuclear weapons, the high capital investment cost, and the potential nuclear waste contamination. Now, the recent major nuclear accident in Japan has created many oppositions because, for example, in Japan, you've seen massive protests right after the nuclear accident in Fukushima. And in Taiwan as well, you see huge protests, as well as Germany. Now, these protests are amplified and widely covered in the mass media as well as social media. So the key question is, what actually shapes public perception of nuclear energy, since the public don't really get to see a nuclear power plant, immediately in their backyard. What they see is usually media coverage of it. Now, a lot of scientists and policymakers alike actually think that pumping in more information would probably increase public knowledge of nuclear energy, and perhaps that might enhance their acceptance of the technology. However, this view seems a little simplistic because already in social science we have seen empirical studies that have shown that value predispositions such as people's individual political beliefs and risk perceptions and benefits perception actually could have an impact on public perception of nuclear energy. So the real question is, besides knowledge, what other factors such as trust, benefit perception, risk perception, and media messages could impact and shape public acceptance of nuclear energy? And how big are these effect sizes? What are, when it comes to science knowledge as compared to these value predispositions, which are the factors that shape public attitudes toward nuclear energy more than the others? And what are the key effect sizes of each of these factors? So my team at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore recently conducted a meta-analysis of empirical studies that were conducted, empirical public opinion studies that were conducted from 1996 all the way to 2016. And we looked at how these different factors impact public perception of the benefits, public perception of risk, as well as public acceptance of nuclear energy. We analyzed 34 empirical studies across the globe, both before and after the Fukushima nuclear accident. Here's some key results from our study. So basically, if you look at what impact public benefit perception of nuclear energy, you can see that knowledge actually has a very small impact on public opinion. Rather, trust, which is highlighted in yellow over here, actually has a larger impact on public benefit perception of nuclear energy in this case. When you look at risk perception of nuclear energy, you can see that a large impact comes from the cost, let me see, what is this? Trust, okay, negative 0.52. The more trust you have, the less perceived risk when it comes to nuclear energy. And also when it comes to gender, you see that males actually have, females actually have a higher risk perception as compared to males. Now when it comes to public acceptance of nuclear energy, the graph really shows here that benefit perception, if the more people believe that there are benefits of nuclear energy, then of course it will highlight in yellow over here. Let me see, it doesn't really show up well here. The yellow over here, 0.48, refers to benefit perception, and the negative ones really refer to cost perception. And if you look across the board, gender, and I guess this is trust and as well as risk perception plays a large role in public perception, public acceptance of nuclear energy as well. Now we also ran Moderator analysis to look at how different countries, public in different countries perceive nuclear energy. And our result shows that trust actually moderated, country actually moderated the impact of trust on benefit perception, public risk perception, as well as public acceptance. So as you can see over here, when it comes to benefit perception, the public in Europe actually, the effect of trust has a larger impact on the public in Europe as compared to Asia. And if you look at risk perception, the impact of trust has a larger impact in Europe than in Asia and North America. And finally, when it comes to acceptance, however, you can see that trust actually plays a bigger role in impacting public acceptance in Asia as compared to Europe and North America. We also ran moderator analysis for time which is before Fukushima accident and after the Fukushima accident. So over here you can see that both benefit perception and trust actually had a larger impact on public acceptance of nuclear energy after the Fukushima accident. So in summary, what does this tell us and what's the implication? I guess the large body of empirical studies and social science have shown that it is simply insufficient to just provide more information about energy policies in order to raise public awareness of nuclear energy, because science knowledge really just play a very minor role in shaping public attitudes toward nuclear energy. In fact, the larger key factors are really value predispositions and people's personal beliefs. And so when it comes to communicating, we advocate that communication strategies should include strategic media framing to convey messages about nuclear energy. So it's not just about the volume of information, it's also about what kind of information and what are the things to emphasize. So for example, some of the panelists talked about the potential low nuclear costs that the new nuclear reactors might bring, the newer ones. And so the key thing is that how do you communicate this information to the public? Perhaps we could highlight the key advantages that the low cost could bring to individual consumers by simply telling them the message that, hey, look, your monthly utility bill is going to decrease by X amount if we go nuclear. This does not only apply to nuclear, of course, but to other renewable sources of energy as well, if indeed it can actually bring down cost. So it's a way of framing the message so that consumers are ready to accept the new technology. In addition, I think effective public deliberation is necessary and should be implemented to include the public in the decision-making of nuclear energy. And of course, an open and transparent deliberation is key to enhance social trust. As you can see from our findings, trust is important. Trust in key stakeholders is an important factor that shape public attitudes toward nuclear energy. And a good deliberation, an open deliberation is necessary so that the public would think that the policymakers are sincere in taking their opinions into account when devising the policy for the energy mix, right? And that's it for my presentation. I look forward to your question. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much to the panel. And we have many questions that have been coming in, so thanks to the audience, both here and the folks that are viewing online. So I wanted to kick off, though, because I'm the moderator, I'm going to exercise a little bit of privilege. I have one question that I did want to ask, and I think it's most appropriate probably for Armand and Jessica, who are, from their presentations, clearly supportive of nuclear. So Mark has talked about and advocated for a scenario in which we have a 100% renewables future. Do you or other nuclear advocates push for a 100% nuclear future? Is there a benefit in that for either practical purposes or for costs, political? Is that something that people talk about?
I'm sure there are nuclear advocates out there who say 100% nuclear. I wouldn't go 100% for many reasons, political reasons, practical reasons. I think we really need a mix, and I think renewables have a place. I think nuclear has a place. I think nuclear could play a much larger role in a lot of countries, but it's not feasible in a lot of places to have 100% nuclear, and you want to keep diversity for a lot of reasons.
I'd agree. I mean, the common sense approach to this is you wouldn't put all your retirement stocks into IBM or GE or one sector. You want to spread it around. I think that I spend a lot of my life working on renewable energy. I still support renewable energy. I think that confining ourselves to one technology family runs the risk of failure, and I think that we can sit here and beat up all night on any one of these technologies and identify its flaws, and inevitably there are going to be issues, as Shirley mentioned, with public acceptance in many places. There are probably many places in the world. I doubt Germany is going to tomorrow decide that it suddenly wants to build a lot of nuclear, and there's going to be places where it's not going to happen. So I think that if we spread our bets around, we have a much better chance of solving the climate problem.
Okay, great, thanks. We've had a lot of questions about policy support for both a 100% renewables plan, what would be needed, and then also what would be needed in a nuclear growth scenario. And a lot of the questions are focusing on parity and wondering what the different levels of support that these two technology groups get. Are they on par, and are they both being positioned to succeed based on public policies? And I guess maybe I could start with you, Mark. Are both of these technologies on equal footing in terms of the policies that are being put forward? Let's keep it, let's say, to the federal government.
Well, one issue, I think you're referring to like subsidies, and because there's past historic subsidies. I mean, nuclear's had received historically a huge amount of subsidies for it to grow. And now wind and solar have subsidies, but so do oil, gas, and coal. But it really becomes a question of what kind of future do you want? I mean, do you want, and how fast do you want to solve the problem? If you don't believe in climate change, if you don't believe in air pollution problems, if you don't believe in energy security, you can use any fuel you want. You can use coal, you can use oil, gas, nuclear. But if you're really trying to solve a problem such as global warming, air pollution mortality, which kills 60 to 65,000 people in the US each year and 47 million worldwide. If you want to solve those problems, you need immediate and fast and least cost solutions that give you the best benefit. So it's been acknowledged that nuclear is expensive in comparison to a lot of other technologies. It's not totally out of the ballpark expensive, but it's more expensive. But if you have limited budgets to spend on trying to solve a problem, and you have a certain short period of time, and it takes so long to get nuclear up, no matter how much you like it, then there's an issue of, sure, you can use nuclear to solve the climate problem, but not until maybe it would take you 100 years to do it that way. If you want to solve it in 15 years, you have to do something different. You can't use nuclear, because you just can't get it up that fast. So you really have to decide what you want to solve, and we want to solve these problems really quickly. And we think that the most practical way, the safest way, because we haven't even addressed really the nuclear proliferation issue, all these countries that don't have weapons right now, or nuclear power, there's a chance that some of them, or one of them, or multiple ones, will try to get weapons. And this is an issue. It's one thing for the US to keep growing nuclear, or China, but for the UAE, for Nicaragua, for countries like Venezuela or Syria, to try to get nuclear power, that becomes a big international issue again. So I think in terms of policy, it's really important to focus on things that we know are safe, things we know that can't solve the problem, that are reasonably low cost, and that people feel comfortable with.
Yeah, Ryan, I would agree with Mark. I think that a lot of people spent a lot of time arguing about, does nuclear have more subsidy or solar or wind or historically. I think that's kind of a losing battle. I would agree with Mark that you have to look at the long term and say what's a reasonable mix. Where I do disagree with Mark is on speed. He offered this observation that it takes a long time to plan nuclear plants. Well, it takes a heck of a long time to plan big wind farms, too. I can tell you, I come from Massachusetts, where we've been talking about one offshore wind plant for 10 years, and it still isn't built. There are very long lead times. Part of the problem with nuclear is the current form of it is stick-built, on-site, massive construction projects. What Jessica laid out is a vision of mass-manufactured stuff that rolls off assembly lines like Boeing's, where they build 700 a year. So I think we can really shorten the time. A lot of the cost of nuclear is in financing. That is the multiple years that the banks are collecting interest as the plant is being built. So if we can compress that 4 or 5 down to 2, let's say, you've got a huge advantage. But I think Mark's basic point is, correct, which is you need to kind of have some vision of what's a practical way forward. I think we just disagree on the details. I would say that Mark's vision is extreme. Again, I support a very large share of renewables in the mix. I don't know what the optimal share is. But what we've found repeatedly in studies is that as you go up the curve and increasing and really push to the sort of 50% plus intermittent penetration, you really go up the cost curve pretty quickly. So to those 40 offshore wind farms, I say, let's build 10 or 20. That would be a lot. But let's keep the options open to balance off the wind and solar with some other things that might actually bring the cost of the package down. And in fact, Mark's own study shows that nuclear is cheaper by his own numbers than several of the renewable technology that he has in his mix.
Okay. I just really wanted to ask you, so we've talked a lot about cost, we've talked about the ability to contribute to efforts to fight climate change. Some of the other major issues that create controversy around nuclear would be things like waste. Mark mentioned proliferation issues. In any of your research, have you identified a commonality or a common theme about the types of issues that are of the most concern to the general public, or do they get kind of splintered based on different demographics? Is there something that is overwhelmingly of greatest concern?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think obviously and definitely that there are generational differences, and there are also demographic differences in terms of how people perceive nuclear energy. I think most people actually get their information and their perception of nuclear energy from the mass media. And in people's everyday life, we don't usually go and talk to people about nuclear energy, or and most of us don't live near a nuclear power plant. So most of the information really that the general public gets about nuclear energy is from the mass media. And most of the time, what media covers probably not the most mundane stuff. Definitely, they cover things that are risky with regard to nuclear energy. So major things like accidents, like Fukushima accident, nuclear accident actually made huge headlines in the media, and that definitely have an effect on public opinion, because media has an effect. And when the media portrays the Fukushima nuclear accident and the scale in which it has affected people, then of course, indirectly, it will leave a deep impression in people's mind. And I think whenever people talk about nuclear energy, the immediate link that they have is with the Fukushima nuclear accident, and the images, the repeated images, in fact, that was shown in the media around 2011. Yeah. So I think that's the major thing that people link up with when they talk about nuclear. And the second thing, really, it's the fear of weaponization of nuclear energy. When, of course, nuclear power plants doesn't correlate directly with weaponization of the technology, but many people still link it with nuclear. And I think that happens because of North Korea. And people, usually would link it to North Korea when they talk about nuclear use as a weapon.
Ryan, just a comment. I mean, this question of public perception versus reality is huge, and we could talk all night about it, and people have written books about it. I mean, the fact of the matter is, nuclear's big liability is that in people's minds it's connected to the Cold War and memories of Hiroshima and so forth. And, you know, I would encourage people in the audience who want to look at the radiological risks, even associated with pretty severe accidents, go to the United Nations websites. They did massive authored peer-reviewed studies. In the case of Chernobyl, they did 300, there were 300, peer scientists working together on this. And the public perception of the risks and impacts of those accidents is so far out of whack with what the epidemiology actually says that it's really astonishing, but it's a reality that has to be dealt with. Likewise, when I tell people that all of the waste created by US nuclear power plants since the 1950s could fit on one football field 30 feet high, people look at that differently. Some people look at it and go, oh my God, that's a lot of waste. I look at it and say, that's a manageable amount of waste. And compared to runaway costs of climate change and managing runaway climate effects, I'd be willing to take that gamble. But, people look at these things differently. I think people imagine that nuclear waste is covering the countryside when in fact it's a very discrete and small amount of stuff. So but this is the big liability. As I go around and talk, I think it's fundamentally a pretty emotional concern, and I think it's hard for people to step back and look at the comparative risks.
So I'm sorry, did you want to say something more?
Well, I think maybe that's minimalizing a little bit. I mean, there's a Florida plant that closed down, I guess, last year, and it's going to take 70 years to decommission it because of the waste, because of the radioactivity that's on site. And even though waste might fit in a football field, the fact is it's spread out everywhere. And it's just like air pollution. I mean, you could take all the air pollution in the world and you can probably compress it into a football field because air is not very dense. But it still kills 4 to 7 million people. So I don't think that's a good analogy.
But the nuclear waste isn't killing anyone. It's quite stable and safe where it is. And it already is very dense. So it's not, you don't have to compact it or anything.
No, my point is that it's spread out. It's an issue that hasn't been resolved. IPCC says it's an issue with robust evidence, high agreement. That's an issue. Mining risks are an issue. Weapons proliferation are an issue. Meltdowns are an issue. The IPCC says these are significant issues, and you're minimizing them.
Yeah. I think it's a question of comparative risks, and the proposal on the table is, as an interim step, let's concentrate the storage in lead casks on one site and figure out what to do. I'm not denying, Mark, that there are issues here. If you take your point of view, which is we don't even have to deal with this because we'll solve it all with wind and solar, then you're right. I mean, there's no reason to get into this discussion. But if you believe, like I think most of the researchers who look at this topic, including the IPCC, the Obama administration plan, I'm sorry, the UN deep decarbonization studies, they all have a significant nuclear share.
You mentioned IPCC. IPCC does not advocate nuclear. It says it's one option. It does not say that it has to be part of a solution. It says it's one option.
But if you look at the models that are included,
what?
If you look at all the different models that the IPCC includes.
There's no model that in IPCC except our model that has run 100% wind, water, solar scenarios. There's no
Why is
model.
that?
What's that?
Why is that?
That's a good question. Why is that? So the fact is there is no other, you can't say that somebody else shows this when they haven't shown anything.
If you look at...
That you can't, sure, you can show that you can decarbonize, but first of all, we're looking at air pollution and decarbonization and energy security, and you're only looking at decarbonization. That's only one of the many issues. So there's no other study that has looked at all these other issues simultaneously.
That's not true.
I don't
They haven't
think
looked
that...
at air pollution, mortality reduction simultaneously, or 100% renewable grids.
They're optimization models.
Or
If
they haven't looked at all
100%
energy
renewables
sectors.
was the best
They haven't
option,
looked
they
at all
would go
energy
with that.
sectors either. They've only looked at the electricity sector for the most part.
No, that's
Ones
not
that have
true,
looked at
right?
all
There's
energy
many
haven't
industrial
accounted for the
studies.
reductions of energy. Look, I know this is my field. I do this.
Well, I think both very accomplished, and I think that this might be part of a question for Shirley as well. The discrepancy between research and science, does that have an impact on people's willingness to dig in further and learn more about this? If it's one established university is saying this and and other internationally recognized or global leader on climate advocacy is saying this. Is there kind of a mental shutdown effect for this? How do people respond when there are mixed facts?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. But just to go back a little bit, backtrack with the discussion with previous. I'll come back to this question.
Okay.
I think Mark has an interesting point, but I also have a question with regard to how applicable is this proposition of yours outside of the United States. Was your study based in the U.S. or have you considered other nations as well? I come from an international perspective because, and particularly from the perspective of Singapore, because we are a very small island country, and we don't have a lot of land masses to build solar panels or windmills and turbines and stuff. Like, we don't have space for those things. So in small countries like Singapore, do you think that 100% renewable energy, energy mix it's applicable?
Yeah, we have a plan for Singapore, and it's at the solutionsproject.org. You can go on there and you can click on the map for Singapore, and the plan will pop up. When we look at grid integration, we combine. I showed you the results for the combination of countries around Singapore that would integrate their grids together, and that's how you get the lower cost. And Singapore is actually there are 3 countries in the world that are the hardest ones, and Singapore is one of the hardest, along with Gibraltar is one, and another really small country. So it's just for the exact same reason you said, but it is a solvable problem.
I think part of the disagreement is, with all due respect, I think you can do anything on a spreadsheet and show that it's feasible, but it's another thing to actually show it in practice. So if you're India and you really need to build a power supply that's probably 4, 5, 6 times what you have, Mark's vision is, well, we'll build a lot of intermittent generation that only runs part of the time, and to compensate for that, we'll put thermal storage underneath every building, factory in the country, and we'll hope that all works and balances. And we'll do hydrogen generation to power transport, running hydrogen factories off of electricity that only operate when the wind blows in the sun. I mean, that's all theoretically possible, and it kind of works out mathematically if you squint. But is India really going to want to go that route? Is there really going to be, does India want to say, no, let's build 2 systems. Let's build a generation system, and then let's build a storage system that's equal or larger. Now, you may have a different answer to that question, Mark. My answer is I don't want to bet the world that people are going to want to basically double or triple the size of the system to supply energy needs. We may disagree on the values, but I think it's unlikely that you will see developing countries go down that path.
Well, there's already a push on worldwide scale for large-scale clean renewable energy plus storage, and costs are dropping so fast that it's happening as we speak. I mean, not only in the U.S., there are 23 cities that have committed to go to 100% renewable energy. There are 82 companies, including the biggest companies in the U.S. There are the U.S., even in the House of Representatives and the Senate, have resolutions for the U.S. to go to 100% clean renewable energy. And there are many countries have committed to.
A commitment is a lot different than.
What's that?
A commitment is a lot different than reality. Germany's not going to meet their commitment.
When I believe that the
California's
U.S.
not gonna
had
meet their
nuclear and it's had nuclear in part of it,
Not in the resolution.
part of its INDC.
House Resolution 540, no, there's no nuclear.
We can get back on that. But I would like to ask you then, if the past 2 energy secretaries, Secretary Chu and Secretary Moniz, have both been supportive of nuclear and said emphatically that it was a vital part of this solution to climate change. And then more recently, Secretary Moniz was saying that at this stage in the game, we're racing against the clock. We have a 2050 deadline, and the deck is pretty handily stacked against us. This is not the time to be removing options from the table, taking clean energy options off the grid or out of the context or the game plan. Why is it important that we narrow down the selections for solutions and tools to just wind, water, solar?
Well, it's an opportunity cost because we know it's nuclear is more expensive. It has more risks associated with it. It takes longer to install, and it releases more carbon than wind, water, and solar. So as a result, it becomes an opportunity cost. If you have a limited budget and you want to solve the problem the fastest with the best benefit, then you want to go with the best technologies. They have an all of the above. This is, for many decades, the U.S. has had all of the above policy. And this is the mistake. And this is the reason we're in our problem we are today, because of this all of the above policy. And Chu and Moniz have parroted that. I mean, I was on the renewables committee for the U.S. Secretary of Energy several years back when Chu was the secretary. Basically, we were tasked with looking at different options, and he came in the first day and says, well, pretty much everything's on the table. This is because that's the policy of the U.S. is to have this all of the above, or has been, to have an all of the above policy. But many people disagree with that, including me, that because this is something I work on, I look at, and I look at air pollution. I mean, I've been working on this for like over 26 years. And I study climate, I study air pollution, I study health, I study energy. I mean, I do this day in and day out. And so I think I have some knowledge about what, how to solve, what the problems are, and what are some solutions that don't work, what things do work. And I'm hoping to impart on people this knowledge and to improve the solutions. Whereas I get a lot of people who come around, they haven't been studying this issue at all, and they suddenly have an opinion about it. And then I'm supposed to say, yeah, you know what you're talking about. No, that's not the case.
I have to say something. Most of Mark's colleagues at Stanford and elsewhere strongly disagree with this view, and take the view that a broad portfolio gives us a much better chance of achieving.
You're talking about Ken Caldera, who admitted in a debate we had, the first thing he says is, I'm not an expert.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. I think we can cite a pile of studies, and I think the concern I have about this line of argument is, I mean, for example, in Mark's own study, he shows, or in his backup, he will show that nuclear is cheaper than several of your technologies like concentrated solar power and offshore wind. That's putting aside all the costs of the storage needed to back all that up.
Cost is one aspect
Okay.
of it.
But you said that it was everything's cheaper. So I think people can play a lot of games with numbers. I think what we've agreed is that a lot of these technologies are within spitting distance of costs, and maybe with advanced reactors we get cheaper, and solar continues to come down. That's all good. I think the question you're asking, Ryan, is do we want to make basically single technology bets? And I think most people in their personal lives don't like to make single all-in bets on one thing. And I think that it's just, that's what these studies tend to say, is that the risk of something going wrong in areas including nuclear are all there.
Well, I do want to get to a couple other topics. We've had some questions that have come in about waste issues, and how can we deal, what is a long-term solution to the waste problem, and specifically some of the questions were teeing off of something Jessica mentioned about waste is normally seen as an impediment to nuclear. How can it be used as a resource? Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so it's a very interesting way that we frame the problem of nuclear waste. Particularly, we call it waste rather than spent fuel. And what makes the U.S. really unique is that we don't recycle our nuclear waste, which most other large nuclear countries, meaning who use a lot of nuclear, recycle their fuel, so they use it twice instead of once. And that cuts the waste in half, which is a pretty big deal. France, who is 80% nuclear power, fits all of their waste in one large room, like a gymnasium, in the floor, and it's very safe and very stable there. So, first step, we could be recycling, but beyond that, there's a lot of better ways to use that waste. And what's really a big challenge of nuclear waste, but also a huge opportunity, is that 96% of the energy is still in there. So it is, I like to think of it as a resource. So a lot of these advanced reactor designs are looking at ways to reuse that spent fuel, to reuse waste directly to get more of the energy out, to get 96, 99% of the energy out rather than just 1% of the energy out. So that results in, you do still have waste. You're never going to be 100% waste-free, but the waste you have is a lot safer, it's a lot less toxic, and it breaks down a lot faster, not tens of thousands of years, maybe tens or hundreds of years. So you're still going to have to find a place to store it, but it's a lot easier of a problem. It's a much more manageable problem. And as Armin said, it does look like a very manageable problem when you realize it all fits on a football field. And probably the interim solution that the U.S. is going to go with is moving to sort of regional temporary storage, which is not too technologically difficult to do. So.
Why doesn't the U.S. reprocess its fuel?
So that's a tough question, but the main answer is economics. Uranium is very cheap. It's been very cheap for a long time, and it does cost money to recycle, just like recycling aluminum cans. If there's a good price on aluminum, it's very economic to recycle. But if aluminum's really cheap, it kind of just piles up in this recycling facility. So it's really costly.
Okay. We've had a couple of questions on kind of an interplay between nuclear and renewables, the way they work on the grid. And I'll add, I recall from the agreement with, for the closure of the Diablo Canyon facility in California, that one of the reasons that was cited for closure was that this large block of a base load, always on energy was going to inhibit progress towards reaching a higher renewables penetration. It wasn't going to match up well with the variability. Are nuclear and variable renewable technologies just inherently incompatible?
There's tension, but they're not inherently incompatible. You can cycle nuclear. Nuclear is cycled in Europe right now, in France and other countries. It's not optimal from an economic standpoint because there's high capital, and you want a high capital cost technology wants to be run close to 100%. But some of the advanced reactors are being designed to cycle. They're designed with built-in storage. So, for example, you might have molten salt being heated up 100%, and then that's saved for a time when the grid needs power and it's run through a generator. Not inherently in odds, but it's interesting, Ryan. The Diablo case kind of raises a question: is what problem are we trying to solve? And sometimes I feel like this debate gets turned on its head, and people say, well, the world is going to intermittency, so we have to only use technologies that are intermittent. And I'm like, is that really the question? Isn't the question, how do we get to the cheapest, fastest, as Mark says? I disagree with the solution set, but Mark has the right question. What's the cheapest, fastest way to zero carbon? And I would argue that there is a pretty healthy role for baseload. What I would do is build the baseload to cover the 50% of the system that's actually base loaded, that is steady demand. You look at any given in Texas or anywhere, about half of the peak demand is going to be 24/7, 365. And I would use the renewables to build on top of that, and that's one way to reconcile.
Yeah, and just to add, advanced reactors are a lot of them are being designed to load follow, but NuScale, the small modular reactor, they're actually they did a study and they put out a white paper looking at how they're designed, which is, standard light water reactor technology, but because they have those tiny reactors in a 12-pack, how they would be really optimal to balancing wind, and particularly because they're looking at deploying in the Pacific Northwest, they wanted to be able to meet the needs of utilities who are balancing these large intermittents. So they think that they could work very well with intermittent renewables. I think that's a great vision going forward.
Yeah, I just want to add that I think there's a lot of debate between going nuclear or going renewables. And I think the debate right now is really, do we go 100%, not 100%, but mostly renewable, and we don't rely at all on nuclear, or vice versa. I think because of this debate, especially in the mass media, I guess that has an impact on public attitudes toward nuclear versus renewable. So whenever people think about nuclear, then they will weigh their odds against renewable energies. And I think that would have an impact, the debate in general, as well as the scientific evidence that are published in the mass media. That would have an impact on how the public think about nuclear and its relation with the other renewable energy.
Mark had brought something up earlier about nuclear in additional countries beyond those that have nuclear capabilities today. And what that makes me think of is some of the questions that have come in regarding weaponization. And so does moving having a nuclear program in a country that currently doesn't have one, so a new nuclear program, does that automatically and very dangerously increase the risk of proliferation? Does one automatically activate the other?
some tenth of it. I mean, it's a probability. I mean, you don't know for sure. But I mean, take Iraq developed a weapon, that's why Israel bombed it. Syria was allegedly developing a weapon, that's why Israel went and bombed there. Venezuela was thinking about it too. And so, a lot of, it's not necessarily that they're going to do it, but there's a possibility. And this is one reason why the U.S. doesn't like to reprocess uranium, because it makes it into more weapons-grade uranium. And it's just a risk that you don't have with renewables. So even the risk might be really small. I don't really know what that risk is, but several countries in the world have developed weapons secretly under the guise of civilian programs or experimental programs of nuclear. So the chances are, if you want to solve the whole world's problems with nuclear, you need 17,000 850 megawatt reactors. We have 400 today. So even if you double to 800, that's only 5% of all the energy. But more countries in the world would have reactors, and then maybe one or two of them would try to develop weapons. I mean, it's just a risk that you take, and you don't have that. So my question really is, to you guys, is if you could solve it with renewables, would you do it? I mean, if you knew for sure you didn't need nuclear.
Absolutely.
Would you still do it?
Absolutely. And I spent the first part of my career trying to site wind plants in Maine, doing energy efficiency. Absolutely, Mark. If I believed that this stuff would actually work at the scale, at the extreme scale that you're proposing, I would be on board 110%. It's the practical concerns, seeing how long it takes to get energy facilities sited, seeing that France decarbonized 75% of its grid in 20 years with nuclear, albeit in a different era. Just seeing that we, just common sense tells me we'll get farther if we go on all these fronts at once. And it's really unfortunate that nuclear has gotten pit against renewables. They're on the same side as far as decarbonization goes, and I don't think there's any reason we can't go full tilt on both. On the non-proliferation question, absolutely. Obviously, a state that wants to acquire nuclear weapons doesn't need a civilian nuclear program to accomplish that. There are plenty of ways to get material without that. Does it make it easier? Yes, marginally easier. I just want to say that some of the advanced reactor designs and the business model that's being developed would involve what's called the build, own, operate, remove sort of model, in which a new state like Nigeria might not even have to open the vessel or deal with it or handle the fuel at all. It could be entirely handled by the vendor in and out. And some of these designs are more like 20, 30-year burns, so that you're not really changing out the fuel. So that may be a mitigating approach.
Thank you. And I'm sorry to cut you off. We only have a couple minutes left, and I've gotten many questions on this one last issue, and it's very timely. Toshiba, the Japanese company that is the parent company of another company that is constructing 2 reactor projects, so 4 total reactors in the U.S., are experiencing a lot of financial difficulties, in most part due to their nuclear business. They are going to be pulling out of the nuclear construction business, and there's turmoil within the company. I guess I can put this, Jessica, I'll look to you first. What does this mean for the future of nuclear? Are people kind of hanging their hats and saying, that's it?
I think there's people who are concerned, but I think this represents sort of a presentation of a broader trend and really highlights something that Toshiba is part of sort of the old industry in a lot of ways. It's large, stick-built nuclear power plants, and I think we're probably maybe seeing the beginning of the end of that model of the large manufacturing firm building nuclear. And I think it opens up a big opportunity for these mass-produced factory modular plants, which is where most companies are moving in that direction. So I think nuclear needs a lot more competition, a lot more firms competing for projects to get the cost down. And Toshiba made some bad investments, and it's good that they're seeing the consequences of that, but I don't think it's a sign of the end times for nuclear. I think it's a sign maybe that old model wasn't working out, but we already knew that.
Ryan, I have a shorter answer. Sun Edison, largest installer, went bankrupt. Solar City, almost bankrupt. that's not the end of solar power. I mean, I think we have to not take these firms mismanage things, but that doesn't mean that the sector doesn't have a future.
Well, we got to end there. We are out of time, but thank you so much to all of you for joining, and thank you to our panelists for taking the time to come and speak here today. Really appreciate the interest, the enthusiasm, and thank you to everybody who submitted questions. Have a good night.
Good evening. I'm Radhakrishnan. I'm the Managing Director of UH Energy here at the University of Houston. I'd like to thank our panelists and our moderator, Ryan Fitzpatrick. Thank you all for taking the time out of your busy schedules to be here. I'm sure you will all agree that it is a great discussion, lots of information, opinions, and insights. It has been a terrific discussion. Okay. We'd like to present you with some plaques. This is as a token of our appreciation for you being here. I would also like to thank our media sponsor, Houston Public Media. A big thanks to the UH Energy student ambassadors and to the Energy Coalition students who volunteered their time to make tonight a real success. We are opening up the wings that you see on the side, and you can go in momentarily over there. We invite you to stay for the reception. Finally, thank you all for coming. On our upcoming symposium events, we have a slight change of plans regarding the fourth and final installment of the 2016-17 symposium series. Due to popular demand, we have changed the fourth and final topic to the future of energy policy, to be held on March 30th. That would be just about the 50th day of the first 100 days of the current regime. We are moving the topic on electric storage. We have not given that up. We're going to move it to September as the opener of the 2017-18 series. Kindly visit us on our website, www.uh.edu/energy, to learn more about registration for both these topics. Once again, thank you all for coming. Please enjoy the reception.